The mansion was everything Elena Martinez had imagined a billionaire's home would be: sprawling, immaculate, and filled with the kind of luxury she'd only seen in magazines. As she followed Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, through the marble-floored entryway on her first day of work, Elena tried not to gawk at the crystal chandeliers and priceless artwork adorning every wall. Before we begin this emotional journey of lost connections, hidden identities, and the power of never giving up on the people we love, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Your support means everything to us. And comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers worldwide. Now let's begin this incredible story. The Hartley estate has 53 rooms, Mrs. Whitmore said in her crisp British accent, leading Elena up a grand staircase. You'll be responsible for the East Wing, 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, the library and the family portrait gallery. Mr. Hartley is very particular about his art collection and family heirlooms. Everything must be dusted carefully, nothing moved from its position. I understand, Elena said quietly. At 47, she'd been cleaning houses for 20 years, ever since she'd left her position as director of St. Catherine's Orphanage. She knew how to be invisible, how to respect people's belongings, how to clean without disturbing the carefully curated lives of the wealthy. What Mrs. Whitmore didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Elena carried ghosts with her. Faces of children she'd cared for during her 15 years at St. Catherine's. Children who'd passed through the orphanage, some adopted into loving homes, others aged out into uncertain futures, and a few, a precious few, who'd stayed in her heart like permanent residents. Mr. Hartley is away on business in Singapore, Mrs. Whitmore continued, but he'll return next week. He expects the house to be pristine at all times. He often brings business associates home without notice, so we must always be prepared. They reached the East Wing, and Mrs. Whitmore showed Elena the supply closet, the linen room and the various bedrooms she'd be maintaining. Finally, they entered what Mrs. Whitmore called the portrait gallery, a long hallway with floor-to-ceiling windows on one side and oil paintings covering the opposite wall. This is Mr. Hartley's most prized possession, Mrs. Whitmore said. His family history, preserved in portraits dating back 6 generations. You'll dust the frames weekly, very gently, mind you. These paintings are worth more than most people's houses. Elena nodded, studying the portraits as Mrs. Whitmore continued her orientation. There were stern-looking men in Victorian attire, elegant women in period dresses, children in formal poses from decades past. The most recent portraits showed a younger version of the billionaire Marcus Hartley. She recognized him from the newspapers, alongside a beautiful woman and a small boy. That's Mr. Hartley's late wife, Catherine, Mrs. Whitmore said, noticing Elena's gaze. She died in a car accident 7 years ago. The boy is their son, Christopher. He's 23 now, but that portrait was painted when he was 16. Elena studied the teenage Christopher in the painting. Dark hair, serious eyes, an expression that seemed both guarded and sad. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at a memory Elena couldn't quite place. Does Christopher live here? Elena asked. No, he's away at Yale studying business. He comes home for holidays and summer breaks. Now, let me show you the library. But Elena couldn't stop looking at the portrait. Something about that face, those eyes, was triggering a memory that felt important but remained frustratingly out of reach. Over the following days, Elena settled into her routine. She'd arrive at 6 in the morning before the family was awake, and work quietly through the East Wing, cleaning, dusting, organizing. The other staff members were polite but distant. They'd seen housekeepers come and go, and they didn't invest in friendships until someone had proven they'd last more than a few months. Elena didn't mind the solitude. It gave her time to think, to remember, to process the life she'd left behind at St. Catherine's. She'd left the orphanage 5 years ago, after the funding dried up and the building was sold. 15 years of her life, dedicated to caring for children nobody else wanted, had ended with a closed door and a broken heart. She tried to keep track of some of the children, but it was impossible. The adoption records were sealed, many had moved away, and some simply didn't want to be reminded of their orphanage past. Elena understood that, sometimes you had to leave the past behind to move forward. But she'd never forgotten. Every child who'd passed through St. Catherine's remained in her memory, a catalogue of faces and names and stories that she carried with her always. On her 3rd day at the Hartley estate, Elena was dusting the portrait gallery when she found herself once again drawn to Christopher's portrait. She stood before it, studying every detail of his face, and suddenly, a memory exploded in her mind with such force that she actually gasped. The dark eyes. The slight curve of the mouth that wasn't quite a smile. The way his left eyebrow corked slightly higher than the right. She knew this face. But it couldn't be. It was impossible. Elena's hands began to shake. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened her photo gallery, scrolling back years until she found what she was looking for. A photograph she'd taken at St. Catherine's 12 years ago. It showed a group of children on Christmas morning opening donated gifts. And there, in the center of the photo, was an 11-year-old boy with dark hair and serious eyes. His name had been Christian. Christian Matthews. No known parents, no relatives who'd claimed him. He'd been at St. Catherine's from age 6 until age 12, when he'd been adopted by a couple who'd specifically requested an older child. Elena had cried when Christian left. She'd become particularly attached to this quiet, intelligent boy who'd loved to read and had once told her he was going to be rich and important when he grew up so he could help other orphans like him. Elena held the phone up, comparing the photograph to the portrait. The resemblance was striking. More than striking, it was identical. 11-year-old Christian and 16-year-old Christopher could have been the same person 5 years apart. But that was impossible. Christian had been adopted by the Johnsons, a middle-class couple from Ohio, she remembered. The file had been in order, the adoption legitimate. How could Christian Matthews, orphan, have become Christopher Hartley, billionaire's son? Unless... Elena's mind raced through possibilities. Had the Johnsons been a temporary placement? Had something happened to them? Had Christian somehow ended up with the Hartleys through another adoption? She needed to know. But how could she ask without seeming intrusive or crazy? She was just a housekeeper. She couldn't exactly walk up to a billionaire and say, "I think your son might be a boy I knew from an orphanage 12 years ago." Over the next few days, Elena became obsessed with the portrait. She'd find excuses to linger in the gallery, studying Christopher's face, comparing it to her memories of Christian. Every detail matched. The slight scar above his right eyebrow that Christian had gotten when he fell from a tree, the distinctive shape of his ears, even the way he held his head with a slight tilt to the left. The more Elena looked, the more certain she became. Christopher Hartley was Christian Matthews. But how? And more importantly, why didn't anyone seem to know? Elena tried to research online, looking for any connection between the names, any adoption records, anything that would explain how an orphan became a billionaire's heir. But she found nothing. It was as if Christian Matthews had ceased to exist after age 12, and Christopher Hartley had always been exactly who he appeared to be. On her 8th day at the estate, Elena was cleaning the library when she found a photograph album that had been left open on one of the reading tables. She knew she shouldn't look. Mrs. Whitmore had been clear about respecting the family's privacy, but she couldn't help herself. The album was filled with family photos. Marcus and Catherine Hartley at their wedding. Catherine pregnant, glowing. And then photos of a baby. A toddler. A young child. But something was wrong with the timeline. The early photos of Christopher as a baby and young child showed a chubby, light-haired boy with round cheeks. But around age 10 or 11, the photos suddenly shifted to show a different child, thinner, dark-haired, serious. Elena's heart pounded. It was as if there were two different children, and somewhere around age 11 or 12, one had been replaced by the other. But that was crazy. Children changed as they grew, especially during adolescence. Maybe Christopher had just gone through a dramatic transformation. But Elena knew in her bones that wasn't what had happened. The Christopher in the later photos was Christian. Her Christian. And somehow he'd been inserted into the Hartley family story. The question was, did Christopher himself know? Did Marcus Hartley know his son had been adopted, or had something more complex happened? Elena was so absorbed in the photo album that she didn't hear footsteps approaching until a voice said sharply, "What are you doing?" She looked up to find Mrs. Whitmore standing in the doorway, her expression severe. I'm sorry," Elena stammered, closing the album quickly. "I was dusting and found this open. I just glanced at it. I didn't mean to pry." Mrs. Whitmore crossed the room and took the album, her lips pressed into a thin line. "The family's personal photographs are not to be touched by staff. Only dusted if they're in the way. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm very sorry." "See that it doesn't happen again," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Mr. Hartley is extremely private about his family life, especially regarding his late wife and son. Any invasion of that privacy will result in immediate dismissal." After Mrs. Whitmore left, Elena's hands were shaking. She'd almost lost her job for looking at a photo album. She needed to be more careful. But she also couldn't let this go. If Christopher Hartley was really Christian Matthews, then he deserved to know the truth about who he was. That evening, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in her small studio apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Christian. The quiet boy who'd loved books and had once told her, You're the only person who's ever really cared about me, Miss Elena. When I grow up, I'm going to come back and help you. I promise. She'd never seen him again after the adoption. The Johnsons had moved away, and Elena had never been able to track them down. She'd assumed Christian was living a good life with his new family, getting the love and stability he deserved. But if Christian had somehow become Christopher Hartley, something must have happened to the Johnsons. Something that resulted in Christian being adopted again, this time by a billionaire family. The next morning, Elena made a decision. She would try to find out more about the Johnsons, about what had happened to them. If she could trace Christian's path from the orphanage to the Hartley estate, maybe she could understand how and why a boy's identity had apparently been changed. She started with the orphanage records. St. Catherine's had closed, but the records had been transferred to a state archive. Elena called and explained she was trying to locate a former child from the orphanage for a reunion. After some bureaucratic runaround, she was given access to Christian's file. What she found was puzzling. Christian Matthews had indeed been adopted by James and Linda Johnson of Columbus, Ohio, at age 12. The file showed everything in order: background checks, home study, final approval. But there was a note stapled to the back of the file, added several years after the adoption. Adoptive parents deceased, car accident. Child's whereabouts unknown. Case closed. Elena's blood ran cold. The Johnsons had died. But what happened to Christian? The note said his whereabouts were unknown, which meant he hadn't stayed in the system. He'd somehow disappeared from state records. Unless he'd been adopted again under a different identity. Under the name Christopher Hartley. But why would Marcus Hartley adopt a 13-year-old orphan and pretend he'd been his son all along? Why create an elaborate fiction that Christopher had always been a Hartley, complete with baby photos and a manufactured history? Elena needed answers, but she didn't know how to get them without potentially destroying Christopher's life, or her own job security. She was just a housekeeper. She had no right to dig into a billionaire's family secrets. 2 weeks after Elena started working at the estate, Marcus Hartley returned from Singapore. Elena first saw him in person when she was dusting the second-floor hallway. He was tall, distinguished-looking, probably in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority that seemed to fill every room he entered. "You must be the new housekeeper," he said, stopping when he noticed her. His voice was deep, cultured. "Elena, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," Elena said, keeping her eyes down respectfully. "Elena Martinez. Mrs. Whitmore speaks highly of your work. I appreciate thoroughness and discretion in my staff. I trust you'll continue to maintain those standards." "Of course, Mr. Hartley." He nodded and continued down the hallway. Elena watched him go, her mind racing. This was the man who'd somehow adopted Christian and transformed him into Christopher. But why? What possible reason could he have for such an elaborate deception? That evening, Elena was finishing her duties in the portrait gallery when she heard voices approaching. She quickly gathered her cleaning supplies, intending to leave before whoever it was arrived, but the voices came too quickly. "Only for a few days," a younger male voice was saying. "I have to get back to campus for midterms." "I understand, but I wanted to see you," Marcus Hartley's voice responded. "It's been months since you were home." They rounded the corner, and Elena found herself face to face with Christopher Hartley. He was 23 now, no longer the teenager in the portrait. He'd grown into his features, tall like his father, with the same dark hair and serious eyes she remembered from Christian Matthews. But there were differences too. This young man carried himself with confidence, wore expensive clothes with ease, spoke with the polished accent of someone who'd attended the best schools. "Oh, excuse us," Christopher said, noticing Elena. "We didn't mean to interrupt your work." "No interruption, sir," Elena said, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. "I was just finishing." She moved to leave, but as she passed Christopher, she stumbled slightly, intentionally. Her cleaning caddy tipped and supplies spilled across the floor. "I'm so sorry," Elena said, dropping to her knees to gather everything. Christopher immediately knelt to help her. "It's fine really," he said, handing her a bottle of glass cleaner. His hand brushed against hers, and Elena looked up directly into his eyes. Those eyes. Dark brown with flecks of gold near the pupils. The exact same eyes she'd looked into a dozen years ago when Christian Matthews had hugged her goodbye and promised to come back someday. "Thank you," Elena managed to say, her voice barely steady. Christopher smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face into something warm and open. "You're welcome. I'm Christopher, by the way. Though I suppose you already know that." "Elena," she said. "Elena Martinez." "Nice to meet you, Elena." He stood, extending a hand to help her up. I hope the old man here isn't working you too hard. Christopher, Marcus said with mild reproach, but there was affection in his tone. I'm just saying, Dad, you have a reputation for being demanding. Christopher winked at Elena. If he gives you any trouble, let me know and I'll talk to him. Elena managed a small smile, gathered her supplies and excused herself. But as she walked away she could feel tears building behind her eyes. That smile. That warmth. That was Christian. Her Christian. The boy who'd promised to come back. But he didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. She was 12 years older and he'd been just a child when they'd known each other. But more than that, Christopher Hartley didn't seem to have any memory of being Christian Matthews. He seemed to genuinely believe he'd always been who he appeared to be. That night, Elena couldn't hold back anymore. She sat on her small apartment floor, looking at the old photo of Christian from the orphanage and cried. She cried for the boy who'd been lost, for the identity that had been erased, for the years they'd been apart. But most of all, she cried because she didn't know what to do with this knowledge. If she told Christopher the truth, it could destroy him. He clearly had a good life, a loving father, opportunities most orphans could never dream of. What right did she have to append all of that with claims about a past he didn't remember? But if she said nothing, Christian Matthews would remain lost forever, erased as completely as if he'd never existed. And the promise he'd made to her, to come back to help her help other children, would remain unfulfilled. The next day, Elena made another decision. She would try to find out more about Christopher's adoption, the real story of how Christian Matthews became Christopher Hartley. She'd be careful, discreet, but she needed to understand what had happened before she could decide what to do with the information. She started by paying close attention to conversations in the household. The other staff members occasionally gossiped, and Elena learned that Christopher had always been homeschooled until high school. Mr. Hartley was very protective after Mrs. Catherine died, one of the older housekeepers told her. The boy was so traumatized they kept him home for years. That fit the timeline. If Christian had become Christopher around age 12 or 13, homeschooling would have hidden the transition. No classmates to remember the old Christopher, no teachers to notice the switch. Elena also learned that very few photos existed of Christopher before age 12. There was a fire in the West Wing years ago, the butler mentioned. Lost a lot of family photographs. Mr. Hartley was devastated. How convenient, Elena thought. A fire that destroyed evidence of Christopher's early childhood, making it easier to insert a new child into the family history. But why? That was the question that haunted Elena. Why would Marcus Hartley go to such elaborate lengths to adopt an orphan and pretend he'd always been his son? What possible motivation could he have? 3 weeks into Elena's employment, she finally found a clue. She was cleaning Marcus Hartley's home office, a space she was only allowed to enter when he was definitely out of the house, when she noticed a locked desk drawer that had been left slightly ajar. She knew she shouldn't. Every instinct told her this was crossing a line. But the drawer was right there, open, and she needed answers. Inside, she found a folder labeled Christopher, Private. Her hands shaking, Elena opened it. The first document was a death certificate. Catherine Hartley, age 37, died in a car accident. But there was another death certificate underneath it. Christopher Hartley, age 12, died in the same accident. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The original Christopher Hartley, Marcus's biological son, had died with his mother. She kept reading, her hands shaking. There were letters from grief counselors, documents about Marcus's psychological state after the accident, records of his breakdown and recovery. And then, buried deeper in the folder, she found adoption papers. Christian Matthews, age 13, adopted by Marcus Hartley. But these weren't normal adoption papers. They were sealed adoption papers with a court order mandating that Christian's birth name be legally changed to Christopher Hartley, and all public records of the adoption be sealed permanently. There was a letter from Marcus to his lawyer. I cannot replace my son. Nothing can bring back Christopher. But this boy, Christian Matthews, he looks so much like Christopher did at that age. If I can give him the life my son should have had, if I can save him from the system that failed him before, perhaps some good can come from this tragedy. I will give him everything. He will have my name, my love, my resources. And in return, I will have a reason to keep living. Elena sat back, tears streaming down her face. She finally understood. Marcus Hartley had lost everything in that accident, his wife and his son. In his grief, he'd found a boy who resembled his lost child, and he'd adopted him, not to replace Christopher but to save them both. Christian got a family and a future. Marcus got a reason to survive his grief. But Christian's true identity had been erased in the process. The boy from St. Catherine's Orphanage had ceased to exist, replaced entirely by Christopher Hartley. Elena carefully returned everything to the drawer, her mind reeling. She now understood the why. But she still didn't know what to do with this knowledge. Did Christian, know the truth? Had Marcus told him that he was adopted, that he'd once been someone else? Or had the trauma of losing the Johnsons, combined with Marcus's grief-driven adoption, somehow caused Christian to block out his earlier memories and fully embrace his new identity? Elena needed to know. But how could she find out without revealing that she'd been snooping through private documents? The answer came unexpectedly 2 days later. Christopher was home for the weekend, and Elena overheard him in the library talking on the phone with someone about a genetics project for one of his classes. "Yeah, I need to submit a family medical history," Christopher was saying. "Dad's going to help me fill it out. Apparently, his grandfather had heart disease, and there's diabetes on my mom's side." Elena froze. If Christopher was filling out a family medical history based on the Hartley family, he clearly believed he was biologically related to them. Which meant either Marcus hadn't told him he was adopted, or the adoption had been so early in his childhood that Christopher had no memory of life before the Hartleys. But Elena knew the truth. Christian Matthews had been at St. Catherine's until age 12. He'd only been with the Johnsons for about a year before they died. He'd been 13 when Marcus adopted him. You should remember. Unless the trauma had been so severe that he'd blocked it out completely. That evening, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She would write a letter to Christopher. She wouldn't sign it or indicate how she knew what she knew. She would simply tell him the truth about Christian Matthews and let him decide what to do with the information. She spent hours crafting the letter trying to find the right words. "Dear Christopher, I'm writing to tell you something about your past that you may not know. You were not always Christopher Hartley. Before you were adopted by Marcus Hartley at age 13, you were Christian Matthews, a resident of St. Catherine's Orphanage from age 6 to age 12. You were a remarkable boy, intelligent, kind, and determined to make something of yourself. You were adopted at 12 by James and Linda Johnson, but they died in a car accident when you were 13. That's when Marcus Hartley found you and gave you a new life. I'm not writing to upset you or to threaten your relationship with your father. I'm writing because you once promised someone that when you grew up, you'd come back and help other children like yourself. You promised to never forget where you came from. I believe Marcus Hartley is a good man who saved you when you needed saving. But I also believe you deserve to know your own history. You were Christian Matthews. You survived abandonment, foster care, loss, and tragedy. You're stronger than you know because of the journey you've already traveled. What you do with this information is up to you. But know that Christian Matthews existed, mattered, and is worth remembering. A friend from your past." Elena sealed the letter and planned to leave it in the library where Christopher would find it. But as she stood there, letter in hand, she heard footsteps and voices approaching. "Need to tell him," a woman's voice was saying. "He's 23 years old, Marcus. He deserves to know the truth." "I know," Marcus Hartley's voice responded, heavy with emotion. "I've wanted to tell him for years. But how do I explain that I essentially replaced my dead son with an orphan who looked like him? How do I admit that I was so destroyed by grief that I couldn't see how wrong it was? You gave that boy a life he never would have had otherwise," the woman said. "You saved him, Marcus. Yes, you erased his past, but you gave him a future. Christopher loves you. He'll understand. Or it will destroy him," Marcus said. "To learn that everything he thinks he knows about himself is a lie." Elena stood frozen, the letter still in her hand as the voices faded down the hallway. Marcus knew the adoption had been wrong. He wanted to tell Christopher the truth, but he was afraid. Elena looked down at the letter, then slowly tore it into pieces. This wasn't her secret to reveal. This was between Marcus and Christopher, or Christian and Marcus. Whatever the truth, whatever happened next, it needed to come from the man who'd saved a grieving orphan and given him a new life. But Elena made herself another promise. She would stay. She would work at this estate, quietly watching over the boy she'd once cared for at St. Catherine's. And if Christopher ever needed to know his true history, if he ever started asking questions or searching for his past, Elena would be there to help him find the answers. Because Christian Matthews had promised to come back. And in a way he just didn't remember making the promise. Elena carefully disposed of the torn letter, gathered her cleaning supplies, and headed toward the portrait gallery one more time. She stood before Christopher's portrait, looking into those familiar eyes and whispered, "I found you, Christian. I finally found you. And I'll keep your secret until you're ready to remember it yourself." As she turned to leave, she didn't notice Christopher standing in the shadows of the hallway, watching her with a puzzled expression. He'd heard her whisper, caught the name Christian, and felt something stir in his mind, a memory perhaps or the ghost of one. For the first time in 11 years, Christopher Hartley felt like he was forgetting something important. Something about who he used to be. And in her small apartment that night, Elena cried tears of both grief and relief. She'd found Christian Matthews. He was alive, safe, successful. He'd grown into a good man despite, or perhaps because of, the strange journey that had brought him from St. Catherine's Orphanage to a billionaire's portrait gallery. The question now was, would he ever remember who he'd been? And if he did, would knowing the truth set him free or destroy the carefully constructed life he'd built? Only time would tell. But Elena would be there, watching, waiting, ready to help him find his way back to himself when the time was right. Because that's what she did. She'd spent 15 years caring for forgotten children. Christian Matthews might have a new name and a new life, but he'd never been forgotten. Not by Elena. Never by Elena. The nightmare started the way it always did. Christopher was in a car, but he was small, a child. Rain pounded against the windows. There was screaming, the sickening sound of metal crushing, glass shattering. Then darkness. But this time, when he woke up gasping and covered in sweat, there was something different about the dream. A voice. A woman's voice saying, "It's okay, Christian. You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." Christian. Not Christopher. Christian. Christopher sat up in bed, his heart racing. It was 3 a.m. and he was in his childhood bedroom at the estate, home for Thanksgiving break. He'd been having variations of this nightmare for years. His therapist said it was his mind's way of processing the trauma of losing his mother. But the voice was new. And the name. Christian. He got out of bed and walked to the window, looking out over the estate grounds. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the manicured lawns. Christopher pressed his hand against the cool glass and tried to remember. Tried to push past the fog that seemed to cloud his memories of anything before age 13. His father had told him it was trauma. That the car accident that killed his mother had been so devastating that Christopher had blocked out chunks of his childhood. "It's normal," Marcus had assured him repeatedly. "The mind protects itself. The memories aren't gone, they're just locked away until you're ready to process them." But Christopher was 23 now. When would he be ready? And why did the memories that did surface feel wrong somehow? Disjointed, like they belonged to someone else's life. He thought about the housekeeper, Elena. The way she'd looked at him in the portrait gallery with such intensity, such emotion. And then 2 days ago, he'd heard her whisper something as she stood before his portrait. He'd only caught fragments. "I found you, Christian. I finally found you. Christian." There was that name again. Christopher pulled out his laptop and for the first time in his life, typed his own name into a search engine with quotation marks, Christian Matthews. The results were sparse. An obituary for a James and Linda Matthews from 12 years ago, a car accident. They'd left behind no children according to the death notice. A few random social media profiles of people who shared the name. Nothing that seemed connected to him. But Christopher kept searching, driven by an instinct he didn't understand. He searched for St. Catherine's Orphanage, after remembering Elena's whisper. The orphanage had closed 5 years ago, but there were articles about its shutdown, photos of the building, references to the hundreds of children who'd passed through its doors over its 50-year history. And then, buried deep in a local newspaper archive, Christopher found something that made his breath catch. A group photo from 12 years ago, Christmas at St. Catherine's Orphanage. The caption listed no names, just orphanage residents celebrate the holiday. But in the center of the photo, standing with a pile of donated gifts, was a boy who looked exactly like Christopher had at that age. Dark hair. Serious eyes. The same slight scar above the right eyebrow that Christopher had always been told came from a bicycle accident when he was 10. But Christopher had never owned a bicycle at 10. He'd been homeschooled, kept close to the estate after his mother's death. When had he gotten that scar? Christopher zoomed in on the boy's face and something inside him cracked open. He knew this child. Not from seeing him in a mirror but from being him. From living inside that small body, from experiencing whatever life had created that serious, guarded expression. "Christian," Christopher whispered to the image on his screen. "I'm Christian." The realization hit him like a physical blow. Memories that had been locked away for over a decade began flooding back, fragmentary but powerful. A dormitory full of bunk beds. Meals at long tables. A kind woman with warm eyes who smelled like lavender and always made time to listen to him read. Elena. The housekeeper was that woman. Older now, grayer, but unmistakably the same person who'd been the director of St. Catherine's Orphanage. Christopher's hands shook as more memories surfaced. The Johnsons, the couple who'd adopted him. Linda's smile. James teaching him to throw a baseball. Then the accident. The police officer with the sympathetic eyes telling him his new parents were dead. The return to the system, to foster care, to uncertainty and fear. And then what? How had he gone from being Christian Matthews, orphaned twice over, to Christopher Hartley, billionaire's son? Christopher checked the time, 3:47 a.m. Too early to confront his father, but too late to go back to sleep. He needed answers, and there was one person in this house who might have them. Elena. He'd seen her schedule posted in the staff room when he'd wandered through the kitchen yesterday. She arrived at 6 in the morning to start her duties. Christopher would wait for her, intercept her before she could disappear into her work routine, and finally get the truth about who he really was. At 5:45 a.m., Christopher positioned himself in the East Wing hallway, sitting on a window seat with a view of the staff entrance. His mind was still reeling, memories and questions colliding. At 5:58, he saw Elena's small figure entering through the service door, carrying her bag, her movements quiet and practiced. Christopher stood and walked to the top of the main staircase. When Elena rounded the corner, climbing toward the East Wing, she stopped abruptly, seeing him there. "Mr. Christopher," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "You're up very early. Is everything all right?" "No," Christopher said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Nothing's all right. I need to talk to you, Elena. Or should I call you Miss Elena? That's what I called you at St. Catherine's, isn't it?" The color drained from Elena's face. Her bag slipped from her shoulder, landing with a soft thud on the carpet. "Christopher, Christian," he interrupted. "That's my real name, isn't it? Christian Matthews. I lived in your orphanage from age 6 to 12. You were the director. You cared for me. And when the Johnsons adopted me, you cried." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "You remember?" "I'm starting to," Christopher said. "But there are gaps. Huge gaps. Elena, what happened after the Johnsons died? How did I end up here with a new name, a new history, everything about me erased?" "You should talk to your father about that," Elena said quietly. "It's his story to tell, not mine." "But you knew," Christopher said, his voice rising. "You recognized me the moment you saw that portrait, didn't you? You've been working here for weeks, knowing who I really am, and you said nothing." "What was I supposed to say?" Elena asked, tears now flowing freely. "That you used to be someone else? That everything you believe about yourself is built on a foundation of—" She stopped, unable to finish. "A foundation of lies?" Christopher finished for her. "Is that what you were going to say? That my entire life is a lie?" "No," Elena said firmly. "Your life is real, Christopher. The love your father has for you is real. The opportunities you've had, the person you've become, that's all real. The only thing that was lost was the memory of where you started." "And where did I start?" Christopher demanded. Tell me everything you remember about Christian Matthews." Elena looked around the hallway. They were alone, but staff would be arriving soon. "Not here. Meet me tonight after my shift. There's a gazebo in the East Garden. 8 o'clock. I'll tell you everything I know." "Why wait?" Christopher asked. "Because you need to talk to your father first," Elena said. "Ask him about the adoption. Ask him about Christian Matthews. He deserves the chance to explain before you hear it from me. What if he lies?" "He won't," Elena said with certainty. "I overheard him a few weeks ago talking about telling you the truth. He's been carrying this secret for 11 years, Christopher. He's been waiting for the right time to tell you. Maybe that time is now." Christopher wanted to argue, but he could see the wisdom in her words. This confrontation, because that's what it would be, a confrontation, needed to happen with his father first. 8 o'clock, Christopher agreed. "The gazebo. Don't disappear, Elena. I need answers." "I'm not going anywhere," Elena promised. "I found you again, Christian. I'm not going to lose you a second time." After Elena continued to her work, Christopher returned to his room and tried to organize his thoughts. Fragments of memories kept surfacing, playing in a courtyard with other children, standing in line for meals, reading books in a corner while chaos swirled around him. And Elena, always Elena, making time for him, encouraging his love of reading, telling him he was smart and special and destined for great things. At 8 o'clock, after a day spent avoiding his father while his mind churned with questions, Christopher finally sought out Marcus. He found him in his study, working on his laptop, a glass of scotch at his elbow. "Christopher," Marcus said, looking up with a smile that faded when he saw his son's expression. What's wrong? I need you to tell me the truth about something, Christopher said, closing the door behind him. About who I am. About who I was. Marcus went very still. What are you talking about? My name, Christopher said, walking closer to the desk. My real name. It's Christian, isn't it? Christian Matthews. I was an orphan. You adopted me when I was 13, after my second set of parents died. You gave me a new name, a new history, and somehow made me forget I'd ever been anyone else. Marcus's face went pale. He set down his glass with shaking hands. How did you find out? So it's true, Christopher said, even though he'd already known. Hearing his father confirm it still felt like a punch to the gut. Everything I remember about my childhood, about growing up here, about Mom, none of it's real? No, Marcus said sharply, standing up. That's not accurate. Christopher, please sit down. Let me explain. I don't want to sit, Christopher said, his voice rising. I want you to tell me the truth. All of it. Right now. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, suddenly looking every one of his 54 years. You're right. You deserve the truth. I should have told you years ago, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of what knowing would do to you. Start from the beginning, Christopher demanded. Marcus moved to the window, looking out at the darkening grounds. 12 years ago, my wife Catherine and my son, my biological son, were in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light. Catherine died instantly. Christopher, his voice broke, my Christopher died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. He was 12 years old. Christopher felt his anger waver slightly in the face of his father's obvious pain. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I wanted to die too, Marcus continued. The grief was unbearable. I couldn't function. Couldn't work. Couldn't see any reason to keep living. My therapist suggested that I needed a purpose, something to focus on besides my loss. She mentioned that there were children in the system who needed homes, and that helping someone else might help me. Marcus turned back to face Christopher. I wasn't looking to replace my son. I want you to understand that. But I visited St. Catherine's Orphanage one day just looking, and I saw you. You were standing in the corner of the common room reading, and you looked so much like Christopher had at that age. The same dark hair, the same serious expression. It was like seeing a ghost. So you decided to adopt me because I looked like your dead son? Christopher asked, trying to keep the bitterness from his voice. No, Marcus said firmly. I decided to adopt you because when I talked to you, I saw who you were. A brilliant, resilient boy who'd survived so much. You told me about the Johnsons, how happy you'd been with them, how devastated you were that they died. And you said something that broke my heart. You said, I guess I'm not meant to have a family. People who take me in always die. Christopher felt a chill. He didn't remember saying that, but it sounded like something the broken 13-year-old version of himself would have believed. I wanted to give you a family, Marcus said. I wanted to save you from believing you were cursed or unlucky. But I was broken, Christopher. Grieving, not thinking clearly. And I made a terrible decision. You erased Christian Matthews, Christopher said. Yes, Marcus admitted. I told myself I was protecting you. That you'd been through so much trauma, your biological parents abandoning you, 6 years in an orphanage, a failed adoption, losing the Johnsons. I thought giving you a completely fresh start, a new identity with no reminders of past pain, would help you heal. But it wasn't just about me, was it? Christopher challenged. It was about you too. Having a son who looked like Christopher, who could step into his life, his room, his place in the family photos. It was easier for you to pretend I'd always been your son than to face the fact that your real son was dead. Marcus flinched as if he'd been struck. You're right. God help me, you're right. In the beginning, it was as much about my needs as yours. I was using you to ease my grief. But Christopher, Christian, whatever name you want to use, I need you to know that I came to love you for yourself. Not as a replacement, not as a stand-in, but as my son. The boy you were, the young man you've become, I love all of it. But you built that love on a foundation of lies, Christopher said. You sealed the adoption records. Changed my name legally. Homeschooled me so no one would know I wasn't the original Christopher. You even manufactured a fire to explain why there were no baby photos of me. How much of my life is real, Dad? How much of what I believe about myself is actually true? Your education is real, Marcus said. Your intelligence, your accomplishments, your relationships, all real. The only thing that isn't real is the history before age 13. Everything after that is genuine. Everything after you erased who I was, Christopher said bitterly. I know, Marcus said, his voice breaking. I know what I did was wrong. I robbed you of your identity, your history. I convinced myself I was protecting you, but really I was protecting myself. And Christian, I am so sorry. Christopher sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. Did I know? When you first adopted me, did I know you were changing my identity? Marcus nodded slowly. Yes. You were 13, not a baby. You knew. But you were so traumatized, so desperate for stability, that you agreed to it. You said, he paused, remembering, you said if becoming Christopher Hartley meant you could finally have a real family again, you'd be whoever I needed you to be. Christopher felt tears burning in his eyes. He could imagine that desperate, grieving 13-year-old, so afraid of losing another family that he'd agree to anything. What about the memories? Did I just forget on my own, or did you? You had therapy, Marcus said. Extensive therapy to help you process the trauma of losing the Johnsons. Your therapist, Dr. Morrison, she knew about the adoption and the name change. She said that sometimes when trauma is severe enough, the mind compartmentalizes. You began referring to yourself as Christopher, living as Christopher, and gradually the memories of being Christian faded. Dr. Morrison said it was a coping mechanism, your mind's way of protecting you from the pain of your past. So I chose to forget, Christopher said quietly. In a way, Marcus agreed. Your conscious mind chose to embrace your new identity, and your subconscious mind helped by suppressing memories that contradicted that identity. Dr. Morrison said it was remarkable how completely you adapted. Within a year, you seemed to genuinely believe you'd always been Christopher Hartley. Christopher stood and walked to the window, looking out at the same view his father had been contemplating minutes earlier. Elena, he said. The housekeeper. She was the director of St. Catherine's. She remembers me as Christian. I know, Marcus said. I recognized her the day Mrs. Whitmore hired her. I almost asked Mrs. Whitmore to let her go, but then I thought, maybe this is fate. Maybe it's time for you to know the truth. I've been working up the courage to tell you, but I kept putting it off. I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid you'd hate me, Marcus said simply. Afraid you'd leave. Afraid that knowing the truth would undo all the progress you've made, all the healing. Afraid that you'd blame me for stealing your identity. Christopher turned to face his father. I should hate you. What you did was wrong on so many levels. You manipulated a traumatized child. You erased his identity. You've been lying to me for 11 years. I know, Marcus said, tears streaming down his face now. I know. And if you want to leave, if you want to change your name back to Christian Matthews, if you want nothing to do with me, I'll understand. I'll help you with whatever you need. But please know that despite the terrible way this started, my love for you is real. You're my son. Not the replacement for the son I lost, but my son. Do you understand? Christopher wanted to stay angry. Part of him was angry, furious at the manipulation, the lies, the theft of his identity. But looking at Marcus, seeing the genuine remorse and love in his father's eyes, he couldn't maintain the rage. I need time, Christopher said finally, to process this, to talk to Elena, to figure out who I am, Christian or Christopher or some combination of both. Take all the time you need, Marcus said. I'm here. Whatever you need from me, I'm here. Christopher nodded and left the study. He checked his watch, 7:45 p.m. 15 minutes until he was supposed to meet Elena. He went to his room, splashed water on his face and tried to organize his thoughts. He was Christian Matthews. Or he had been. But he was also Christopher Hartley, 11 years of memories, experiences, growth. Could a person be two people? Could he honor both identities? At exactly 8 o'clock, Christopher made his way to the gazebo in the East Garden. Elena was already there, sitting on one of the benches, her hands folded in her lap. When she saw him approaching, she stood. Did you talk to your father? She asked. Yes, Christopher said. He told me everything. Or at least his version of everything. Now I want to hear yours. Tell me about Christian Matthews. Help me remember who I was. Elena smiled through tears. Sit down. I'll tell you everything. They sat together in the gazebo and Elena began to talk. She told him about the day he'd arrived at St. Catherine's, a quiet 6-year-old who barely spoke. About how he'd gradually opened up over the years, revealing his intelligence and his hunger for learning. About how he'd devoured every book in the orphanage's small library. You were special, Christian, Elena said. All the children at St. Catherine's were special, but you had something extra. A determination to rise above your circumstances. You used to tell me that you wouldn't let being an orphan define you. That you were going to make something of yourself. Did I have friends? Christopher asked. At the orphanage? A few, Elena said. You were closer to the books than to the other children, but there was a girl, Sarah. She was about your age, very sweet. You used to read to her. What happened to her? Christopher asked. To Sarah, to the other children I knew? I lost track of most of them after the orphanage closed, Elena admitted. Sarah was adopted by a family in California when she was 14. I don't know where she is now. They talked for over an hour, Elena sharing memory after memory, helping Christopher piece together a picture of who he'd been. He learned that he'd been quiet but not shy, serious but with a dry sense of humor that occasionally surprised people. He learned that he'd once wanted to be a writer, that he'd filled notebooks with stories. Do you still have those notebooks? Christopher asked. The ones from the orphanage? Elena shook her head sadly. When St. Catherine's closed, most of the personal items were lost or thrown away. I'm sorry, Christian. I wish I'd saved more. It's Christopher now, he said. Or maybe it's both. I don't know yet. But Elena, why didn't you say something sooner? When you recognized me, why did you stay silent? Because I wasn't sure what was right, Elena admitted. I could see you had a good life. A father who clearly loved you. Opportunities that Christian Matthews never would have had. Who was I to destroy that by dredging up a past you'd moved beyond? But I hadn't moved beyond it, Christopher said. I'd just forgotten it. There's a difference. I know that now, Elena said. But at the time I thought I was protecting you. And then I overheard your father talking about telling you the truth, and I realized it wasn't my secret to reveal. It was his. You should have told me, Christopher said, but without anger. But I understand why you didn't. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Elena spoke again. Christian, there's something else you should know. Something you told me the day the Johnsons adopted you. What? You made me a promise, Elena said. You said that when you grew up you were going to come back. You were going to help St. Catherine's, help other orphans like yourself. You said you'd never forget where you came from, and you'd use whatever success you had to help others. Christopher felt something stir in his chest, a sense of purpose, of unfinished business. I forgot, he said. I forgot the promise. I forgot you. I forgot everything. But now you remember, Elena said. And Christopher, Christian, whoever you decide to be, that promise still matters. Those children still need help. St. Catherine's is closed, but there are other orphanages, other children growing up the way you did. You have the resources now to actually make a difference. Christopher looked at Elena, this woman who'd cared for him when he was small and lost, and who'd stayed silent about his identity to protect him. You never forgot me, he said. Did you? All these years you remembered Christian Matthews. Every child who passed through St. Catherine's stayed with me, Elena said. But you, Christian, you were special. I never stopped wondering what happened to you. And when I saw that portrait, when I recognized you, I felt like I'd been given a gift. The chance to see that you'd survived, that you'd thrived. That's all I ever wanted for you. Thank you, Christopher said. For caring about me then. For caring about me now. For being the one constant between Christian and Christopher. Over the following days, Christopher struggled to integrate his two identities. He spent hours looking at the old photo Elena had shown him, Christian Matthews at Christmas, surrounded by other orphans. He tried to remember the faces in the photo, the names, the relationships. Some memories came back, fragmentary and incomplete. Others remained locked away, possibly forever. He also spent time with Marcus, working through the complicated emotions of betrayal, love, anger, and gratitude. Their relationship was strained but not broken. Marcus gave Christopher space while making it clear he was available whenever Christopher needed him. I don't expect forgiveness, Marcus told him one evening. What I did was unforgivable. But I hope someday you can understand why I did it. I already understand, Christopher said. You were drowning in grief and you grabbed onto anything that might save you. I just happened to be that thing. It wasn't malicious. It was just human. You're more generous than I deserve, Marcus said. Maybe, Christopher agreed. But you gave me a life I never would have had otherwise. Yes, you erased Christian Matthews. But you also created opportunities for whoever I am now. I'm trying to figure out how to be grateful for that while also acknowledging that what you did was wrong. Let me know when you figure it out, Marcus said with a sad smile. Because I haven't managed that balance yet. A week after the truth came out, Christopher made a decision. He called Elena to his father's study. Marcus had agreed to let them meet there, and said, I want to do something. To honor Christian Matthews and keep the promise he made to you. What do you have in mind? Elena asked. A foundation, Christopher said. Dedicated to helping orphans and children in the foster care system. Funding for education, mentorship programs, support for kids who age out of the system. Everything Christian Matthews needed but didn't always have. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Christian would be so proud. Maybe, Christopher said. But more importantly, it's the right thing to do. I have resources now, my father's money, my education, my connections. Christian Matthews would want me to use those things to help others like him. And like you, Elena pointed out. You're still that boy, Christopher. You just have a different name now. Over the following months, Christopher threw himself into creating the foundation. Marcus supported the project enthusiastically, contributing significant funding and business expertise. Elena helped by providing insight into what orphans and foster children actually needed, based on her years of experience. They called it the Matthews-Hartley Foundation, a name that honored both of Christopher's identities. The foundation's mission was to provide comprehensive support to children in the foster care and orphanage systems, from educational resources to emotional support to help with transitioning to independence. As the foundation took shape, Christopher found himself healing. The anger at Marcus faded, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of how grief and trauma could drive people to make questionable choices. He didn't forgive everything, he didn't think that was possible, but he accepted that his father had loved him, even while manipulating him. He also found peace with his dual identity. He was Christopher Hartley legally and socially, but he acknowledged Christian Matthews privately, as the foundation of who he'd become. Both boys, the orphan and the billionaire's son, were part of his story. 6 months after the truth came out, the Matthews-Hartley Foundation held its launch event. It was a gala at the Hartley estate, attended by philanthropists, celebrities and politicians. But Christopher had also insisted on inviting former St. Catherine's residents, anyone Elena could track down. As the event wound down, Christopher found himself standing once again in front of his portrait in the gallery. Elena approached, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. Quite a night, she said, handing him a glass. It is, Christopher agreed. Elena, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think Christian Matthews would be happy with how things turned out? With who I became? Elena considered this carefully. I think Christian Matthews would be amazed. He was a boy who'd been abandoned, who'd lost everything multiple times, who had every reason to be bitter and angry. But he wasn't. He was determined and hopeful. He believed he could make something of himself. She paused, looking at the portrait. You did make something of yourself, Christopher. You became exactly what Christian dreamed of being, successful, secure, and in a position to help others. The path was strange and complicated, but the destination is right. I used to wonder why I felt so empty sometimes, Christopher said. Like something was missing. I think part of me always knew I'd forgotten something important. Someone important. But you remembered, Elena said. And that boy you were, Christian Matthews, he's proud of you. I'm sure of it. As they stood together in the portrait gallery, surrounded by the history of the Hartley family, a history Christopher now knew he'd been artificially grafted into, he felt a sense of peace. He was Christopher Hartley, Yale student, billionaire's son, foundation founder. But he was also Christian Matthews, orphan, survivor, keeper of promises. Both identities were real. Both mattered. And together they made him whole. Marcus approached them, looking hesitant. Christopher, there's someone here who wants to meet you. A young woman named Sarah Chin. She says you knew each other at St. Catherine's. Christopher's heart jumped. Sarah. The girl he used to read to. Elena had found her. Bring her over, Christopher said. A moment later, a woman in her mid-20s approached, petite, Asian, with a warm smile. Christian, she said uncertainly. Is it really you? It's Christopher now, he said. But yes, it's me. You remember? Of course I remember, Sarah said. You were the boy who made the orphanage bearable. You read me stories when I couldn't sleep. You shared your snacks when I was sad. Christian Matthews was my best friend. Christopher felt emotion overwhelming him. I'm sorry I forgot you. I'm sorry I forgot everything. But you remembered eventually, Sarah said. Elena told me what happened. About the adoption, the name change, everything. Christopher, I'm so happy you ended up okay. You deserved a good life. So did you, Christopher said. Are you okay? Did things work out for you? They did, Sarah said. I was adopted by a wonderful family. I'm a teacher now. I work with kids who've been through trauma, helping them process their experiences. I think my time at St. Catherine's prepared me for that work. They talked for a long time. Sarah filling in more pieces of Christopher's forgotten past, helping him remember who Christian Matthews had been. Other former St. Catherine's residents approached, each with their own memories, their own pieces of the puzzle. By the end of the night, Christopher felt like he'd been given a gift, not just the recovery of his lost identity, but the restoration of relationships he'd forgotten existed. These people had known him before he was Christopher Hartley. They'd known Christian Matthews and they'd cared about him. As the guests departed and the staff cleaned up, Christopher found his father on the terrace, looking out over the grounds. "Thank you," Christopher said, sitting beside him. "For tonight. For supporting the foundation. For not trying to hide my past anymore." "Thank you for forgiving me," Marcus said. "I know the damage I did can't be completely undone. But seeing you tonight, surrounded by people who knew Christian Matthews, watching you honor that identity while still being Christopher Hartley, it gives me hope that you'll be okay." "I am okay," Christopher said. "Or I will be. It's complicated. But Dad, and you are my dad regardless of biology, I want you to know that I don't regret being Christopher Hartley. Yes, you erased Christian Matthews in a way that was wrong. But you also gave me opportunities that Christian never would have had. Both things are true." "I'm grateful you can see it that way," Marcus said. "But Christopher, I need you to know something. I've been in therapy myself, working through why I did what I did. And I've realized that while I told myself I was saving you, I was really trying to save myself. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it." "I know," Christopher said. "And I've realized something too. Forgetting Christian Matthews, embracing Christopher Hartley, that probably saved me too. After the Johnsons died, I was broken. Becoming someone new, someone without that tragic history, gave me permission to move forward instead of staying stuck in grief and trauma. So maybe we saved each other," Marcus said. "Maybe," Christopher agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, father and son, bound by love and lies and the complicated truth of their relationship. It would never be simple. The foundation on which their family was built would always be questionable. But the love was real. That much Christopher knew. Inside, Elena was gathering her belongings, preparing to leave for the evening. Christopher found her by the staff entrance. "Elena, wait," he said. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "You kept Christian Matthews alive," Christopher said. "Even when I forgot him, even when the world forgot him, you remembered. You kept his promise alive. And now, because of the foundation, Christian Matthews will help hundreds of kids who are growing up the way he did. That's because of you." "It's because of you," Elena corrected. "You're the one who had the courage to remember, to embrace both identities, to turn pain into purpose." "Then it's because of both of us," Christopher said. "Christian Matthews and Miss Elena, reunited after all these years. Just like he promised." Elena smiled through tears. "Just like he promised." As Elena drove home that night, she thought about the strange journey that had brought her from St. Catherine's Orphanage to the Hartley estate. She'd been hired to clean a billionaire's mansion, but she'd ended up helping a lost boy find himself. Christian Matthews had lived in her orphanage. She'd cried when he was adopted the first time, celebrated his chance at a real family. She'd grieved when the Johnsons died, worried about what would happen to him next. And then he'd vanished from the system and she'd assumed she'd lost him forever. But she hadn't lost him. He'd just been transformed, his identity erased but his essence preserved. And when she saw his portrait, saw those familiar eyes staring out at her from a billionaire's gallery, she'd burst into tears, not just from recognition but from relief. Christian Matthews was alive. He was safe. He'd become someone remarkable. And now, through the Matthews Hartley Foundation, Christian's story would help countless other children find their way from darkness into light, from abandonment into belonging, from fear into hope. Elena had spent 15 years caring for forgotten children. Christian Matthews might have had his name changed and his history rewritten, but he'd never been forgotten. Not by her. Never by her. And now the world would remember him too, not as an orphan who got lucky, but as a young man who turned his pain into purpose, his trauma into triumph, his lost identity into a legacy that would save others. The boy who lived in the orphanage had become the man in the portrait. And the maid who burst into tears when she recognized him had helped him remember not just who he'd been, but who he was meant to become. Sometimes, Elena thought, the most important promises are the ones we make to children. Because children remember even when they forget.